Sir, stand up. You don't live here. Move along.
I do live here. You're on my steps.
ID, now or cuffs.
I'm not resisting. But you're about to arrest the owner because a stranger said so.
Hands behind your back!
Do it. And this camera becomes Exhibit A.
You don't live here. I've never seen you before, and you need to move along. Now. Marcus Thorne didn't look up immediately. He turned the page of his Wall Street Journal, the crisp paper crinkling in the morning silence, and took a slow, deliberate sip from his porcelain teacup. The steam rose in the cool autumn air, mingling with the scent of dried leaves and old brick. He was 62 years old, a man whose presence usually commanded silence in federal courtrooms, but today he was simply a man enjoying the morning sun on his own property. "Did you hear me?" The voice was younger, shrill with entitlement, and edged with a nervous aggression that Marcus had heard too many times in his life. "I said you need to leave. You're loitering." Marcus finally lowered the paper. He adjusted his wire-rimmed reading glasses and looked down the steps of the brownstone. Standing on the sidewalk was Greg Miller, 29 years old, a junior marketing analyst who had moved into Unit 2B 3 weeks ago. Miller was dressed in expensive running gear that looked like it had never seen a drop of sweat. His face flushed not from exertion, but from the self-righteous indignation of a man who believes he is defending his castle against an invader. "I heard you quite clearly, young man." Marcus set his voice a deep, resonant baritone that had once silenced unruly defense attorneys with a single syllable. "And I am quite comfortable where I am." "This is a private residence," Miller snapped, stepping closer to the wrought iron gate. He didn't open it, maintaining the barrier between himself and the man he deemed a threat. "We have families in this building. Professionals. We don't want people hanging out on the stoop like this is a public park. It brings down the property value. It makes people uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" Marcus repeated the word, tasting the irony of it. He looked at the brownstone rising behind him, 4 stories of immaculately restored 19th century architecture. The gargoyles he had paid to have re-sculpted the mahogany double doors he had sanded and stained himself 20 years ago. "And who exactly is uncomfortable?" "I am," Miller declared, pulling his smartphone from an armband carrier. "And the other tenants will be when they come out. Look, I don't want any trouble. Just pick up your stuff and go to the shelter or the park. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police." Marcus folded his newspaper neatly and placed it on the small bistro table next to his chair. He looked Miller in the eye, his expression unreadable, forged by decades of witnessing the best and worst of humanity from the bench. "You are free to do what you feel is necessary. But I would advise you to consider whether a man drinking Earl Grey tea in a silk robe and reading the financial section constitutes an emergency." Miller didn't like the tone. He didn't like the lack of deference. In his mind, the equation was simple. He was the resident, the paying tenant, the one who belonged. Marcus, a black man sitting still in a gentrifying neighborhood, was the variable that needed to be removed. It didn't matter that Marcus was wearing a robe that cost more than Miller's car payments. It didn't matter that his posture was one of regal ownership. Miller saw only what his bias allowed him to see an intruder. "Fine, have it your way," Miller muttered. He tapped the screen furiously, holding the phone to his ear while glaring at Marcus. 911, what is your emergency?" "Yeah, hi," Miller said, his voice pitching up to sound more victimized. "I'm at 4200 Oakwood Avenue. There's a man sitting on the front steps of my building refusing to leave. He's loitering and he's being aggressive." "Is he threatening you, sir?" the dispatcher asked. Miller hesitated, glancing at Marcus, who had gone back to reading the stock quotes. He's refusing to leave after I asked him nicely. He's trespassing. I don't feel safe entering my own home. He's a big guy, and he's just sitting there staring at me." "We have a unit in the area," the dispatcher confirmed. "Stay on the line or keep a safe distance. Officer Vance is en route." "Thank you," Miller said, hanging up. He crossed his arms, a smirk of triumph touching his lips. "Police are on the way. You can still leave, you know. Save yourself the hassle." Marcus didn't respond. He simply turned another page. He knew the law better than the officer who was about to arrive. He knew the statutes regarding trespassing, the definition of curtilage, and the constitutional protections of property owners. But he also knew something darker, something that transcended the law books. He knew that when the police arrived, the truth would be secondary to the optics. He was a black man on a stoop. Miller was a white man in distress. The script had been written long before either of them was born. Officer Kyle Vance was 27 years old and had been with the department for 5 years. In that half-decade, he had cultivated a reputation among his peers as a hard charger, a term used by his supporters to describe his proactive policing, and by his detractors to describe his reckless disregard for civil liberties. Vance was the kind of officer who saw the world in binary terms, wolves and sheep. He considered himself the sheepdog, though his disciplinary file suggested he often had trouble distinguishing the sheep from the scenery. He had 6 prior complaints on his record. 4 were for discourtesy, 1 for excessive force, which had been settled out of court, and 1 for bias-based policing that was currently under review. His supervisors had noted in his last performance evaluation that Officer Vance struggles with patience and needs to improve de-escalation tactics. Yet here he was on patrol in a sector that required the utmost sensitivity, armed with a badge, a gun, and a dangerous amount of unexamined prejudice. When the call came in, "Suspicious person refusing to leave 4200 Oakwood," Vance's mind immediately filled in the blanks. Transient, drunk, aggressive, probably mental health issues. He hit the lights and siren for 2 blocks just to cut through the morning traffic before silencing them as he turned onto the tree-lined street of Oakwood Avenue. He pulled the cruiser to the curb, the tires crunching against the dry autumn leaves. Through the windshield, he assessed the scene. He saw a young white male in athletic gear standing on the sidewalk, looking agitated and pointing. He saw an older black man sitting on the top step of the brownstone, looking entirely too relaxed. To Officer Vance, the relaxation was an affront. It read as arrogance. It read as, "I don't respect your authority." He stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his utility belt, his hand instinctively resting near his holster, not drawing but ready. A power move. "Officer over here," Miller called out, rushing toward Vance as if seeking sanctuary. "I'm the one who called. He's still there. He won't move." Vance nodded at Miller, offering a reassuring conspiratorial look that said, "I've got this, citizen." He walked past Miller, striding up the walkway with the heavy, purposeful gait of a man who intends to intimidate. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at Marcus Thorne. "All right, partner," Vance said, his voice loud, designed to command the space. "Time to move along. You can't camp out here." Marcus slowly closed his newspaper. He folded it into quarters and set it down again. He picked up his tea, took a sip, and then finally looked at Officer Vance. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and completely unimpressed. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said calmly. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. I am not camping." "The resident here says you're trespassing," Vance said, thumbing back toward Miller. "And he wants you gone. So you have 2 choices. You can walk away, or I can help you walk away. Which is it going to be?" "I am the resident," Marcus said. His voice didn't waver. "In fact, I am the owner of this building. I am sitting on my own front porch." Vance scoffed a short, sharp sound of disbelief. He looked at Marcus, the silk robe, the slippers, the newspaper. Then he looked at the context his bias provided a black man in a high-value historic district claiming to own the whole building. It didn't fit the pattern Vance had built in his head. "Yeah, and I'm the police commissioner," Vance retorted, stepping onto the first stair. "Look, don't play games with me. Do you have ID that proves you live here? A lease, a key?" I do not carry my identification while I am having my morning tea on my own property, Marcus said, and I am under no legal obligation to provide it to you simply because you demand it. I have committed no crime. There is no reasonable suspicion of a crime. This is a consensual encounter, and I am choosing to end it. Good day, officer. Vance's face reddened. The rejection of his authority was like a physical slap. In his 5 years, he had learned that people who cited the law were usually jailhouse lawyers, criminals who knew just enough to be annoying. He didn't see a retired federal judge with 30 years of jurisprudence behind him. He saw a problem. It's not a consensual encounter when you're trespassing, Vance snapped. The complainant states you don't live here. That gives me reasonable suspicion to detain you until we figure out who you are. Now stand up. Officer, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. You are making a grave error. I strongly suggest you speak to your supervisor before you take another step up these stairs. I don't need a supervisor to handle a vagrant, Vance spat. He ascended 2 more steps, closing the distance. Last chance, ID or cuffs. From the sidewalk, Greg Miller watched with a mixture of vindication and nervousness. He's really stubborn, Miller offered. He acts like he owns the place. They always do, Vance muttered to himself, his eyes locked on Marcus. Stand up. Put your hands behind your back. The air on Oakwood Avenue seemed to grow heavy, the ambient noise of the city fading into a dull hum as the confrontation on the steps sharpened into a dangerous point. Marcus Thorne remained seated, his posture rigid but not threatening. He knew that any sudden movement, any reaching for a phone or a wallet, could be interpreted as a threat by an officer. This keyed up. He had presided over enough wrongful death suits to know how quickly reaching for ID turned into reaching for a weapon. I am not standing up, Marcus stated, enunciating every consonant. And I am not providing identification. You are currently violating my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. You have no probable cause. You have the word of a man who moved in 3 weeks ago against a man who has lived here for 35 years. I'm done asking, Vance growled. He reached for his handcuffs. By now, the commotion had drawn attention. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood as long as Marcus was watering her hydrangeas. She stopped the hose dripping onto the pavement and stared. Officer! Mrs. Higgins shouted, her voice surprisingly strong. Officer, what are you doing? That's Mr. Thorne. Vance ignored her. He was locked in a tunnel where the only reality was his authority and Marcus's defiance. To acknowledge the neighbor would be to admit doubt, and Officer Kyle Vance did not do doubt. Sir, turn around now. Vance commanded, his hand unclipping the retention strap on his holster, hovering there as a warning. You are escalating a non-existent situation, Marcus said. I am asking you to de-escalate. Call your sergeant. Verify the property records. Do your due diligence before you put your hands on me. I'm the police. I am the due diligence, Vance said. He lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the left arm. The contact was shocking. Marcus, a man who had been treated with deference for decades, felt the rough grip of the young officer's fingers digging into his bicep. He didn't pull away. That would be resisting. He went limp, a passive resistance that forced the officer to support his weight, making the optics even worse. I am complying, Marcus announced loudly, projecting his voice for the witnesses who were now gathering. 2 other neighbors had stepped out onto their porches. A courier van had slowed down, the driver watching. I am not resisting. I am being assaulted on my own property. Stop fighting me, Vance shouted, performing for the imaginary body cam audience, creating a narrative of resistance where there was none. He yanked Marcus up from the chair. The teacup rattled on the table but didn't fall a small mercy. Officer, are you crazy? It was Mr. Henderson from next door, a corporate attorney in his 50s. He was walking briskly toward the scene, his briefcase in hand. That is Judge Thorne. You are arresting a federal judge." Vance paused for a fraction of a second. Judge. But the momentum was already too far gone. His brain frantically rejected the information. A judge wouldn't be sitting on a stoop in a robe. A judge wouldn't refuse to show ID. A judge would respect the badge. Know these neighbors were lying covering for one of their own. Or maybe it was a nickname. Judge, like a street name. "Back off," Vance yelled at Mr. Henderson. "Stay back or I'll arrest you for obstruction." "You are making a mistake that will cost you your badge," Henderson warned, stopping at the gate but holding up his phone to record. "That is Marcus Thorne. He owns this building. He owns the building next door, too." Greg Miller. The caller looked at Mr. Henderson, then back at Marcus. The color began to drain from his face. "Wait. He owns the building," Miller stammered. I thought he was homeless." "You thought wrong," Marcus said, looking past the officer to the tenant. "And your ignorance has now weaponized the police department." Vance tightened his grip, twisting Marcus's arm behind his back with unnecessary force. The pain shot up Marcus's shoulder, an old rotator cuff injury flaring up instantly. He winced, but bit back the cry of pain. He would not give this officer the satisfaction of hearing him beg. "You're under arrest for trespassing, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest." Vance recited the rote memorization of the charges, acting as a shield against the reality crashing down around him. "Trespassing on my own property," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Fascinating legal theory, officer. I look forward to hearing you explain it in court." The metallic click, click, click of the handcuffs was a sound that usually signaled the end of a chaotic situation. For Officer Vance, it felt like victory. For Marcus Thorne, it was the sound of a system failing in real time. Vance shoved Marcus forward, forcing him to bend at the waist. "Spread your legs, wider." He patted Marcus down, his hands rough and invasive over the silk robe. He found nothing but a handkerchief and a pair of reading glasses in the pocket. No weapon, no drugs, just the accoutrements of a gentleman. "These cuffs are extremely tight," Marcus stated calmly. "I have a circulatory condition. You are required to check for spacing." "They're fine." Vance dismissed not checking. He grabbed Marcus by the bicep again and marched him down the stairs. As they reached the sidewalk, the audience had grown. There were now 6 or 7 people watching. Phones were raised like a phalanx of digital witnesses. Mr. Henderson was narrating into his recording. "It is 8:45 a.m. Officer has just handcuffed Marcus Thorne, retired federal district court judge, on his own front steps. The officer refused to verify ownership." Greg Miller stood frozen near the gate. He looked like a man who had pulled a loose thread and watched the entire sweater unravel. "Officer," Miller said, his voice trembling. Maybe we should check if he lives here." "You called me, remember?" Vance snapped at Miller. "You said he was trespassing. I'm removing the threat. You can give your statement at the station." I didn't know." Miller trailed off. Vance guided Marcus toward the patrol car. The indignity of it was palpable. Marcus Thorne, who had spent 30 years interpreting the Constitution, who had sworn in mayors and signed warrants for major FBI takedowns, was being shoved into the back of a Ford Explorer like a common drunkard. "Watch your head," Vance said, pushing Marcus down. Marcus maneuvered his large frame into the cramped plastic seat. The hard plastic dug into his back. His shoulders screamed in pain from the angle of his arms. The door slammed shut, sealing him in the cage. The smell of stale vomit and industrial cleaner assaulted his nose, the scent of misery. Through the wire mesh, he watched Officer Vance strut around the front of the car. Vance looked energized, pumped full of adrenaline. He said something to Miller, who looked sick, then got into the driver's seat. "Comfortable back there?" Vance asked, adjusting his rearview mirror to look at Marcus. "Officer Vance," Marcus said, seeing the nameplate on the dashboard. "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember exactly how confident you feel right now, because it is the last time in your professional life you will ever feel this way." Vance laughed. It was a nervous, arrogant laugh. Yeah. Everyone's innocent. Everyone's got a lawyer. You can tell it to the judge. I am the judge, Marcus said softly. Vance put the car in drive and peeled away from the curb, leaving the confused and horrified neighbors of Oakwood Avenue in his wake. He didn't radio his mileage. He didn't radio that he had a prisoner in custody until he was 3 blocks away. He was operating on autopilot, convinced that his badge was a shield that could deflect any reality he didn't like. But in the back seat, Marcus Thorne wasn't just sitting. He was working. His mind was cataloging every second. Time of arrest, 8:47 a.m. Cause none. Verification none. Force excessive. Miranda warning not read. He was building the file in his head, a dossier that would not only clear his name, but would dismantle the culture that allowed Officer Vance to exist. The ride to the precinct took 15 minutes. Vance played talk radio loudly, a petty power move designed to drown out any attempts at conversation. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, seemingly unbothered by the gravity of what he had just done. In his mind, he had cleaned up the streets. He had responded to a citizen's complaint and removed a non-compliant individual. It was textbook, his textbook. They pulled into the sally port of the 12th precinct. The heavy metal doors rolled down behind them, shutting out the sunlight. Vance killed the engine. Let's go, Vance said, opening the back door and hauling Marcus out. Marcus's legs were stiff. The circulation in his hands was beginning to fade. His fingers felt numb and cold. He walked with as much dignity as a man in a bathrobe and slippers could muster, head held high, eyes scanning the environment. Vance marched him through the intake doors, past the holding cells where a few hungover souls gripped the bars, and into the main processing area. The air smelled of coffee and toner ink. At the main desk sat Sergeant Dennis Kowalski. Kowalski was 58 years old, a 30-year veteran who had seen it all. He was 2 years away from retirement and spent his days ensuring that the young hotshots didn't burn the precinct down. He was drinking coffee and reviewing a shift schedule when Vance walked in with his prisoner. "What do we have, Vance?" Kowalski asked without looking up. "You bring in the Hamburglar. Trespassing, disorderly resisting." Vance rattled off, pushing Marcus toward the bench. "Guy was loitering on a stoop on Oakwood. Refused to leave. Refused ID. Got aggressive." Kowalski looked up. He saw the silk robe. He saw the expensive leather slippers. He saw the face. Kowalski froze. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He blinked once, twice, hoping his old eyes were deceiving him. He lowered the cup slowly to the desk. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "Vance," Kowalski said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who is this?" "Some vagrant. Refused to ID. Guy claims he owns the building." Vance chuckled. "Can you believe that—" Kowalski walked around the desk. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at Marcus Thorne. He looked at the handcuffs digging into the wrists of the man who had presided over the racketeering trial that Kowalski had testified in 10 years ago. The man who was a fixture at the annual Police Foundation Gala. "Your Honor," Kowalski whispered. Marcus nodded once. "Good morning, Sergeant Kowalski. I believe we met during the O'Malley trial. You've lost weight." Kowalski's face went pale, then a deep, flushed red. He turned to Vance. The look in his eyes was not anger, it was horror. It was the look of a man watching a train derail in slow motion. "Vance," Kowalski said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Do you know who this is?" "He's the suspect," Vance said, confusion clouding his features. "He refused to identify." "This is Judge Marcus Thorne," Kowalski roared, the sound echoing off the cinder-block walls. The entire booking room went silent. Officers at computers stopped typing. A prisoner being fingerprinted turned to look. "He is a retired federal district court judge. He is the chairman of the Civilian Oversight Board, and he owns half the damn block on Oakwood Avenue." Vance took a half step back. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickly feeling in his gut. He said he was... He told you, Kowalski shouted. He told you he was the owner. Did you verify it? Did you call it in? The caller said... Vance stammered. I don't care what the caller said, Kowalski yelled. He turned back to Marcus, his hands hovering over the cuffs, but afraid to touch them without permission. Judge, I am so sorry. I don't know what... Vance, give me the keys. Now. Vance fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking. He dropped them. They clattered on the linoleum floor. Leave them, Marcus said. His voice was calm, contrasting terrified chaos of the room. Do not uncuff me yet, Sergeant. Sir, Kowalski asked. I want the watch commander down here, Marcus said. And I want a photographer. We are going to document the injuries to my wrists before these cuffs come off. Everything is going to be by the book, because Officer Vance here is very concerned with the law. Vance looked at Marcus. For the first time, he saw the man not as a suspect, but as a giant. And he realized with a terrifying clarity that he was the one in chains. Captain Elena Rossi stormed into the booking area 3 minutes later. She had been in a budget meeting when Kowalski's call came through, and she had run down the hallway in her dress shoes. Rossi was a reformer, a commander who had spent 3 years trying to weed out the precise kind of behavior that was currently standing in her intake room. She saw the tableau Judge Thorne standing by the bench, still in his robe, still handcuffed. Sergeant Kowalski standing at attention looking like he wanted to vomit. And Officer Vance standing in the corner, stripped of his bravado, looking like a child who had broken a priceless vase. Unlock him, Captain Rossi ordered, breathless. Immediately. The judge requested photos first, Captain, Kowalski said. For the evidence file. Rossi looked at Marcus. Judge Thorne, I cannot find the words. Save them, Captain, Marcus said. Let's get the documentation done. A crime scene technician looking terrified snapped photos of Marcus's wrists. The metal had cut into the skin. Thin lines of blood were visible. The bruising was already forming dark purple against his skin. Once the photos were taken, Kowalski unlocked the cuffs. Marcus rubbed his wrists slowly. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He simply adjusted his robe. I'd like a chair, please, Marcus said. Kowalski scrambled to bring a chair from the desk. Marcus sat down. He looked at Captain Rossi, then pointed a long finger at Officer Vance. Captain, Marcus began, his voice taking on the cadence of a courtroom ruling. Officer Vance arrested me on the curtilage of my own home. I informed him of my status as the owner. He refused to verify. I informed him of his violation of the Fourth Amendment. He interpreted that as resistance. He used excessive force on a compliant 62-year-old man. He ignored the testimony of 3 independent witnesses at the scene who identified me. He failed to read me my Miranda rights. Marcus paused. This was not a mistake, Captain. A mistake is a clerical error. A mistake is a wrong turn. This was a willful exercise of bias. He saw a black man. He saw a white accuser. And he decided the law did not apply. Captain Rossi turned to Vance. Her eyes were hard as flint. Officer Vance, step forward. Vance shuffled forward. Captain, I was just following the... Be quiet, Rossi hissed. You have 11 complaints in your file, Vance. We gave you retraining. We gave you mentorship. And today you arrested a federal judge because you couldn't be bothered to check a property record. I thought he was lying, Vance whispered. Because of who he is, Rossi asked. She didn't wait for an answer. Badge and gun. Put them on the desk. Captain, Now! Rossi shouted. Vance reached to his chest. He unpinned the silver shield that he had polished that morning. He unbuckled his gun belt. The weight of the equipment hitting the desk sounded like a gavel falling. You are placed on administrative leave effective immediately pending an internal affairs investigation, Rossi said. Sergeant Kowalski, escort Mr. Vance out of the building. He is not to enter the secure areas again." Vance looked at Marcus one last time. There was no defiance left, only fear. He was escorted out the back door, a civilian without a job walking out into a city that was about to know his name. "Judge," Captain Rossi said, turning back to Marcus, "I will drive you home myself. I will have the department physician examine your wrists, and I will personally ensure this is handled." "Oh, it will be handled, Captain," Marcus said, standing up. "But not just internally. You have a systemic problem in this precinct. Vance is a symptom. I intend to be the cure." By the time Captain Rossi dropped Marcus off at 4200 Oakwood Avenue, the story had already broken. Mr. Henderson's video had been uploaded to Twitter and had amassed 2 million views in 3 hours. The hashtag Judge Thorne was trending globally. The video was damning. It showed the calm, regal older man in the robe and the aggressive, shouting young officer. It picked up the neighbors screaming, "That's the judge," and the officer ignoring them. It captured the moment of the arrest, the twist of the arm, the sheer indignity of it. Greg Miller, the tenant who had called 911, was hiding in his apartment. He had seen the video. He had seen the comments. Who is the Ken who called the cops? Evict him. Racist neighbor. At 2:00 p.m., a process server knocked on Miller's door. He opened it a crack. "Greg Miller." "Yes." "You are being served with an eviction notice for violation of the harassment and nuisance clauses of your lease," the server said, handing him a thick envelope. "You have 3 days to vacate." "But he can't do that," Miller stammered. "I have a lease. The owner of the building has terminated it for cause. Engaging in criminal harassment of the landlord is a breach of contract. Read the fine print." Miller watched the server walk away. He was being evicted by the man he tried to have arrested. 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed. Thorne v. City Vance et al. It was not a standard civil rights filing. It was a masterpiece of legal drafting written by Marcus himself with the assistance of the top civil rights firm in the state. It cited 42 U.S.C. 1983, but it went deeper. It attacked the training protocols of the department. It attacked the supervisory negligence that allowed Vance to remain on the force despite his record. The press conference was held on the steps of the brownstone, the scene of the crime. Marcus stood at the podium, his wrists bandaged. "I am not here for money," Marcus told the sea of microphones. "I have money. I am here because if this can happen to me, a man who knows the law, who owns the ground he stands on, who has the resources to fight, then what happens to the young man who has none of those things? What happens to the man who cannot quote the Fourth Amendment? He goes to jail, or he goes to the morgue." The journalists dug into Vance's past. They found the patterns, the insufficient evidence findings on previous excessive force complaints, the comments from supervisors that were ignored. It became a national scandal. The mayor was forced to issue a public apology. The police chief resigned 2 weeks later. The city attorney took one look at the case and the video evidence and told the city council, "Write the check. There is no defense here. If we go to trial, Judge Thorne will cross-examine the department himself, and he will tear us apart." 6 months later, the settlement was finalized at $6.5 million. It was the largest individual payout for a wrongful arrest in the city's history. But the check was just paper. The real victory was in the consent decree that Marcus Thorne had negotiated as part of the settlement. Officer Kyle Vance had been terminated and decertified. His name was added to the National Registry, ensuring he would never carry a badge in any jurisdiction in the United States again. He was currently working for a landscaping company in a different state. His career in law enforcement a permanent ruin of his own making. Greg Miller had moved back to Ohio. His reputation in the city shattered his name forever linked to the incident. But on Oakwood Avenue, the morning was quiet. Marcus Thorne sat on his front steps. He was wearing a new silk robe. A cup of Earl Grey tea steamed on the bistro table. The Wall Street Journal was open on his lap. He wasn't alone. Next to him sat a young lawyer, a 25-year-old black woman named Sarah. She was the first hire of the Thorn Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit clinic Marcus had funded with 100% of the settlement money. The clinic was dedicated to providing free legal representation to victims of racial profiling and police misconduct. So, in this case, Marcus was saying, pointing to a file Sarah was holding, you don't just argue the stop was illegal. You argue that the pretext for the stop was based on a flawed policy. Attack the policy, Sarah. That's how you change the system. I understand, Judge, Sarah said, scribbling notes furiously. Attack the root, not just the branch. Precisely, Marcus said. He took a sip of tea. He looked out at the street. A police cruiser drove by slowly. The officer inside looked at the brownstone, saw Marcus, and gave a respectful nod. Marcus nodded back. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It meant the message had been received. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the sun on his face. He thought about the handcuffs. He thought about the cold cell. He thought about the anger that had threatened to consume him, but he let it go. He had turned that anger into a shield for others. He had taken the indignity of that Tuesday morning and built a fortress of justice out of it. He opened his eyes. Read me the next case, Sarah. It's a young man in the South Ward, Sarah said. Arrested for sitting in his own car. Officer said he looked suspicious. Marcus sighed a deep, heavy sound. The work wasn't done. It would never be truly done. But now he was back on the bench, not in a courtroom, but here on his steps, guiding the next generation of fighters. Take the case, Marcus said. Let's get to work. This story isn't just about a bad apple. It's about a rotten tree. It's about how authority, when unchecked by humility and blinded by bias, becomes tyranny. Officer Vance didn't just fail to do his job. He failed to see a human being. He saw a stereotype, and he let that stereotype drive him off a cliff. But it's also a story about the power of knowing your rights and the importance of ownership, not just of property, but of your own dignity. Marcus Thorn couldn't stop the cuffs from going on, but he ensured that when they came off, the world would change. What do you think? Should police officers be personally liable financially for lawsuits when they violate civil rights, rather than the taxpayers footing the bill? And have you ever had to prove you belonged in a space that you had every right to be in? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice and holding power accountable, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us tell more of these stories. Until next time.